for joining. My name is Greek Adamar, and I am Senior Director with PFMD, and I'm here as we're starting this Lunch and Learn. And for some of you, because I realize there are many people joining, it may not be a Lunch and Learn, but a Breakfast and Learn or a Dinner and Learn. So glad to have you with us. We're at this session where we'll be looking at the rules of engagement. Some of you may have been present at the first session, which had taken place in March of last year. We're looking at navigating the codes of conduct for patient engagement. Go to the next slide, please. Okay. As we're getting started, just a couple of house rules to walk through. So if we could ask you to be engaged, we would love to hear your comments coming through the chat. We will be having all microphones on mute, but you have the possibility to unmute those if you want to speak up. Please provide any specific questions that you may have and would like the speakers to address in the chat box, and we will then pick those up during the Q&A at the end of the session. If you could have any feedback or any other thoughts, indeed, put those in the chat box. The session is being recorded and it will be made available to you. And the most important thing is let's make this workshop interesting and do this together. So if we can go to the next slide, please. There is an opportunity for you, if you choose to do so, to turn on the live translation bit. So here you have, all you need to do is click on the open box here, and that will take you to the live translation tool. Okay. Walking through the agenda, we are going to have a busy agenda. We've got some fantastic speakers joining us. We're looking at the overview of the rules of engagement and of the National Trade Associations and country codes of conduct. We'll be introducing the PE country guidelines and exploring some examples along with the PE country guidelines. The end of the session, as mentioned, there will be a panel question and answer session for you to so your questions can be addressed, or any other comments or thoughts. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Yes, so I would really and warmly welcome our speakers. So glad they have joined us. So Juana Juana Scarlatescu has joined us from FBA, and Juana is joining us as Director of Strategic Partnerships, Health Systems at FBA. We also have Andrea Kakutz joining us, who is Compliance Advisor for Life Sciences in GCO Global. Sarunas Narbutas is a professional lawyer, patient advocate, and is currently president of the Lithuanian Cancer Patients Coalition. And Susan Daniels has joined us. She is Senior Vice President, Patient Strategy and Engagement at Humanity. So really looking forward to this interesting session, and I would like to hand over to our very first speaker, who is Juana. Juana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Greet, and hello everyone. Good to see many familiar names among the participants. Very quickly, I'm with FPA, and we represent the biopharmaceutical industry in Europe, and many of our member companies will be familiar to all of you. In my role, I'm really privileged to be working with patient organizations and patient representatives from across Europe, and also with my colleagues very closely in ethics and compliance. I'm also here on behalf of my colleague Julie Bonhomme, who joined you at that inaugural webinar last year. So very quickly, as you'll see on the next slide, I will walk you through the hierarchy of rules that govern how we interact as an industry with patient organizations and patient representatives and other stakeholders in healthcare. And I will be referring always to the European rules, but many of you who are acting at global level will also be familiar with the IFPMA Code of Practice, which will be included in resources as part of this webinar. So just to put a bit the framework there. So always starting with the strongest legal framework, which is the EU directive, and we'll go further into details on that, dating back to 2001, that governs the promotion of medicinal products, but also has implication on how we, as a pharmaceutical sector, then deal with interactions with patient organizations and other stakeholders. And that directive is really the highest standard that we have, and then that gets transposed at national level into national legislation. So that's the legal basis. And then on top of that, we have the EFPIA code, which is a self-regulation code that gets transposed in the national codes as well. And you'll have colleagues on this call who will specifically handle that middle part of the pyramid while we focus on the top and the bottom. So over to that, just bear in mind the EU directive is the strongest one, but it really reflects also its time. It dates back to 2001. So it doesn't have provisions specifically, or it doesn't have a category for patient organizations or patient representatives. So as you'll see in the next slide, it means that the provisions that are applicable to the general public as part of the directive are also applicable to patient organizations and patient representatives. And they mostly refer to the prohibition of promotion about prescribed only medicines. And remember this acronym POM, it will come up throughout the next few slides. And it's within that framework that we are, for the purposes of the directive, interacting with patient organizations that says what we can and cannot do. So that's probably the most important information for you to know, that there is no specific category for patient organizations, and that has implications because they are part of the general public category. However, the FPA code, as you will see on the next slide, self-regulation, as I mentioned, but we have this FPA code. First, important to say that it's applicable to all our member companies, and it's applicable in their interactions with patient organizations, patient representatives, healthcare professionals, and other stakeholders. And we do have categories. So contrary to the directive, we do have categories for patient organizations and patient representatives. So that is the framework that us as an industry use as a self-regulation in dealing with these categories. And that later patient representative category was actually an update that we did to the code in 2019 to reflect the changing pace of the patient advocacy landscape. So with our code, now that we have the different categories in place, it also governs different interactions that the industry has with patient organizations and patient representatives. So you will see on the next slide the variety of those interactions, and they can be, and they're familiar to many of you on the call, whether, if you could just go back to slide 10, thank you. You'll see the type of interactions that they can be: donations and grants that support healthcare research or education. So it's always, for the purposes of the code, we need to have a legitimate reason for the collaboration, and that could be donations and grants, that can be sponsorship or contracted services. If you're wondering which those categories are and what they represent, we can also touch that on the panel, and the slides will also be available for you afterwards. The types of interactions, regardless of what they are, have to be legitimate, and there are two principles that apply to that are part of the FPA code. A company, so our members cannot require that they be the sole funders or sponsors of a patient organization, because we encourage a broad funding or sponsorship principles. Of course, if that happens, it can happen, and it's okay as long as the company is not the one requesting that they be the sole funder. And then secondly, regardless of the type of interaction that you have here, from donations to contracted services, All other provisions in the code, including everything related to events, hospitality, or prohibition of gifts, also apply to the interactions between industry and patient organizations. So again, what to take from here, the code is flexible enough to allow for different types of interactions, and it stays with those two principles to have diversity of funding, and all the other rules under the code apply regardless of the type of interactions. So on to the next slide, you will see more, we drill down further into more specific requirements applying to patient organizations as they interact with the industry for the purposes of the code. And then some will be for you common sense, but they're worth reiterating. So that principle of partnership that we enter as an industry in collaboration with patient organizations, and to really ensure that those collaborations are done in an ethical and transparent manner. That we respect the independence of patient organizations in terms of their activities, their policy positions, or their political judgments. Mutual respect, again, is obvious, and that those interactions also are given equal weight. So the views and decisions of each party have the same value, that we don't promote a particular product, prescription-only medicine, and that we're transparent and we disclose on both sides these types of interactions. And we go back to the principle of legitimacy, to always have a written agreement for the support provided to patient organizations, and that we can't influence the text or any sort of materials that are provided by patient organizations that as an industry we enter into an interaction with. So as I'm coming towards the end, we're only 3 slides until I finish. Why are all these rules? Where they're not to make our lives difficult for the sake of making it difficult, but it's really to protect each other, to reiterate the legitimacy of the collaboration, to ensure that there's no improper interaction or perception of impropriety, to make sure that the key principles of no promotion of a prescription-only product. So we go back to the first slide that comes into the directive, that principle is held strongly, and that the collaboration is legitimate, and really the function of ethics and compliance as we work with patient organizations and the patient engagement colleagues is to manage and to reduce the risks and to secure the collaboration. So it's in both our interests to do so within the ethical and compliance rules. So down to my last 2 slides. If you come away with anything at this, whether it's breakfast and it's too early, or it's dinner and it's late in the day, if you go back and say, okay, what does it mean for me? Maybe for the patient organizations in the audience when engaging in industry, what are my rights and how do they boil down from this framework? Well, the right to transparency. Every time you have an interaction with industry, you have to be informed about its purpose. You have to have full disclosure of how the data coming out of that collaboration will be used, and any compensation should be proportional and commensurate with the experience, the expertise, and the time invested that you bring in. We've gone through the principles of respect and that equal value that your contributions brings to the collaboration. And also importantly, we encourage long-term commitment over short-term needs and collaboration. And then your privacy and informed consent must be obtained also handled according to the current rules and GDPR and national privacy laws. And participation always has to be voluntary, and you shouldn't go through any undue pressure as part of the collaboration. And similarly, what are your obligations? It's also to stay informed. If you're part of the collaboration, ask questions and stay informed about its goals, and don't hesitate if you're unsure about technical aspects to ask for clarification. Maintain confidentiality, as you'd want your confidentiality to be maintained, but also about the specifics of a collaboration, but disclose interest. So if you're part of any relationship that may be bearing an impact on the collaboration, do disclose that. It helps, again, to avoid any perceptions of impropriety. as well. So as I'm rushing to that, I realize you may have more questions. There will be a panel for that, but here are also some resources, some that I mentioned, our code of practice, also the resources that we've co-developed with the patient think tank, and the IFPMA, so our sister organization at global level, and their code of practice for colleagues who are in both at international and European level. And with that, as I take a deep breath, I will also pass it on to our colleague Andrea, who will walk us through the national codes and national realities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juana. Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to see you here. As Juana mentioned, I will continue talking a bit about the national trade associations and the code of conduct of each country to make it a bit more close to your knowledge as well. And as we kick off a bit the topic, we also have a question for you. We were wondering how acquainted are you with the national pharmaceutical associations and their code of ethics? Have you been working with them? Do you know they exist? Do you sometimes refer to them whenever you are encountering with a situation when you have to engage with someone from the industry? So we invite you to either scan the QR code on the screen or click on the link and then submit your vote. Then we will have a bit of an overview of how acquainted we are with these. I think it's going quite well. No matter if you're very familiar or somewhat familiar or you never heard of it, that's why we are here to also make an introduction of these. Okay. I think we have enough insight. It's good to see that we also have attendees which are familiar, but also attendees that are not familiar at all. I think then it's going to be an interesting discussion. So I will then continue by talking about the Pharma National Trade Associations and try to explain a bit the context and their importance. As you can see on this slide, the Pharma National Trade Associations could be set up at global level, regional level, or national level. You can see some examples here on the screen of these associations. And the purpose of these associations is that they represent the interest of pharmaceutical companies within a specific country or region. They also exist to provide a unified voice for the pharmaceutical industry, also advocate for policies that normally support innovation and access to healthcare, and promote also best practices within the industry. As you can see, they can be organized at global, regional, or national level, and they play a crucial role in representing the interests of the pharmaceutical companies within their respective countries or region, advocating, of course, for the policies that support innovation, access to healthcare, and they promote transparency and ethical interactions. They are very important as they serve as a platform for industry networking, knowledge sharing, and advocacy on issues affecting the pharmaceutical sector. They can also provide resources to support the member companies, facilitate dialogue with regulatory bodies, and promote ethical business practices. By representing the industry as a whole, these associations ensure that the pharmaceutical sector operates in a transparent and responsible manner, ultimately benefiting patients and healthcare system as well. They serve as a platform also for industry networking, knowledge center, and also advocacy. And they also provide the resources to support any member companies with training programs, regulatory guidance, or any market insights that a company might need whenever they want to engage with the industry. With respect to engaging with patients and patients' organizations, I believe that the national trade associations play a vital role in engaging with either patient organization, patient advocates, or patients, just because it allows to understand better the needs and the perspective of patient organizations and patients as well. Also, by collaborating with patient groups and patient advocacy groups, the pharmaceutical companies can develop more patient-centric approaches to healthcare. They can improve access to treatments, they can enhance patient outcomes, and they can also involve the patients already from early stage of their journey. Again, building strong relationship with the patients' organizations and advocacy groups is essential for fostering trust and promoting transparency, ensuring that the pharmaceutical industry remains focused on meeting those needs as needed, of course. Also, they collaborate with patients and patient advocacy groups so they can develop more patient-centric approaches to healthcare and also improve their outcomes. As you can see, that's why it's important to have them involved, and also important to maybe refer to these guidelines and practices whenever you are engaging with the stakeholders in the pharmaceutical industry. Now I'm gonna move to the next slide and talk a bit about the national codes of conduct and their significance. We will go through a few key components of the typical code of ethics for a pharmaceutical trade industry. It's important to also mention that they are guidelines that outline the ethical standards and best practices from interactions between pharmaceutical companies, healthcare professionals, patient organizations, and patients as well. The adherence to this code is crucial just because every country has its own internal regulations or laws that can be in addition to the code of ethics of each country. And it's important to consider the whole spectrum of legislations when looking at this national code of conduct. By following the national code of conduct, the pharmaceutical company demonstrate their commitment to the upholding the ethical standards and protecting the patient's interests, promoting responsible engagements with stakeholder transparency and compliance interactions, of course. It's important for the pharmaceutical industry to adhere to this code, or at least consider them whenever they are engaging with a healthcare professional, a patient group, a patient advocate, or a patient. So that's why this is where it starts. Let's say whenever you want to engage with a patient group or patient, it's a good starting point to go and refer to the National Code of Conduct. As you can see also here on the slide, each code of conduct has, let's say, a similar structure. So they refer to their compliance with the law and regulations, either at local level or country level. They also include provisions about transparency and disclosure, about patient safety, public health, the fair competition as well is also mentioned. The data integrity and scientific accuracy also is important. And the purpose of each code, of course, it's the continuous improvement. So any members that adhere to these codes are encouraged to continuously review and update their internal policies to make sure they are up to date with the standards of the pharmaceutical industry. Later down the presentation, we will also provide a few examples on how certain regulations can be interpreted in this code. So for now, I will pass it to Sarunas, which will walk you through his train of thoughts. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Andrea. So I'll start a bit from Adam and Eve, but not that way back, of why we are discussing this today as a continuous work between the pharmaceutical companies and the patient community. As was introduced in the beginning, my background is a lawyer, actually specializing in life sciences, but I'm a cancer patient living with an active condition for over 18 years, and as such involved in the advocacy work at national level, which is through Lithuanian Cancer Patient Coalition, European level, through Youth Cancer Europe, and at the global level through Similar Advocates Network. And in these 18 years of my collaboration with pharmaceutical companies, it's I think quite a realistic estimate that I've signed over 100 different agreements for interactions. And of course, how it started way back, most of the time, it was those agreements were adapted templates used by pharmaceutical companies for healthcare professionals. And now we're at the stage where, due to the number of interactions, there were a number of documents aligned bilaterally between the patient community and industry of the way forward. Of course, there's still a case where some of the companies are still using these, let's say, not updated principles and are still using the templates intended for healthcare professionals. And the easiest way for me to spot that, if in Europe I'm seeing in the contract the pharmacovigilance provision that I have to report something, I know that as an agreement intended for the patient advocate, I know it was not designed for the patient advocates. I know it's just an afterthought. And there is also, I understand that there may be people in this call who represented maybe medical devices, biotech, not necessarily pharmaceutical companies. And even they were parties to these discussions. I see that that part of, let's say, life sciences ecosystem is not moving that much ahead as pharmaceutical companies addressing these topics, how to engage the patient advocates, patient organizations, lay patients, and what to do. So if we go to the next slide, it's still, you will be able to look not just in my photo, but into something that PEOF and PFMD have been developing for a number of years. When Oana was presenting a slide with a number of documents that were co-created, she was also showing a document called Reasonable Agreements between pharmaceutical company and the patient community, which is an effort collectively done by the leading pan-European patient advocacy networks and 12 pharmaceutical companies at the time to agree on what is the middle ground, what should be actually included in the agreements, rather than everyone as pharmaceutical company finding their own way to invent a bicycle, what to include. Should the agreement be 5 pages or 50 pages? And believe me that I've seen both, and not coming from US. In US, we know it's lengthy, but even in Europe, it's been the case. Then there was another example included through the guiding principles on patient engagement and also on remuneration, co-developed with PFMD. I was also involved in that initiative. And that work was done during the COVID times, where we actually reviewed a number of global and European and international self-regulation codes by the pharmaceutical companies, compared it, what is the common denominator, compared what is the reality, what the patients are facing when interacting, and once some clauses changed and came to the principles of how it should be done. And now what is presenting here about patient engagement guidelines is a further step from that. So it's all almost building up on a work of that has been going on for nearly a decade. I think 8 years, if I'm right, from the work that this reasonable agreement started, to then the PFMD work on the guiding global principles and remuneration, to now the country-specific guidelines. And as you see on the left, I will not go through this. You can clearly see the slides, and the slides will be available afterwards as well. But there are, of course, some particular issues which are of relevance to everyone going into the agreement on remuneration, reimbursement, hospitality, transfer value reporting. But those are the principles of what should be included. However, we know that the national legislation sometimes might be more strict, may not allow something. And as such, there was this effort by PFMD to go into the national level and see what of these principles that have been aligned among the stakeholders and agreed can it be fully enforced at the national level? Should it be something done in deviation to that, or alternatives should be sought? So if you go to the next slide, you will see a number of countries where these guidelines are currently available. 22 countries so far. I've calculated just now, 8 of them are outside of European region, which is very good. So you see, it's not just US and Canada. We see Philippines, we see Japan, Singapore, India, Brazil. So very good progress, and that progress was made because the people like you who are on these calls and are interested in the topic, they're vocal and saying that why is it just, in English, why is it just tailored to Europe? Maybe we can look something for our region. And as such, I encourage you to also type in the chat if you are passionate about your region, which doesn't have a guidelines yet, that it could be done. It's not that difficult to be adding more guidelines. The PFMD is committed to do that. But of course, it has to be done very cautiously where the need is, and that there could be an uptake of these guidelines. And in summary, I think that this is a continuous struggle and continuous exercise. And if I'm saying, you know, sometimes we make one step forward and two steps back when making a progress, but nevertheless, it's still not standing at standstill. There are things which I have personally witnessed have improved since adoption of these guiding principles. There are things which I've seen has stalled, and there are things which I have seen pharmaceutical companies reintroduce the templates for healthcare professionals being used for the patient advocates. And that is something that we can do better, I believe. But if we just stop for a moment and celebrate of the progress achieved in the past decade on this, I think that the industry as such is much more clear, and that industry, I mean the patient engagement leaders within the companies, the compliance officers dealing with contracting, are much more aware of the nuances and differences when the counterparty can be a patient organization as a legal entity, can be an individual. Individual may be a lay patient, may be a patient organization representative, may be a patient advocate, may be a patient expert. We will not delve that deep there, but I'm saying that we are not just trying to make sense what it is. Like you need as an industry to engage with the patient community and might be lost how to do it. You know, do you have to find an organization? How do you approach individual? What to be aware of in terms of local limitations. Now I think we have a lot of case studies which will be presented after me, and a lot of wealth of knowledge in the community, including in the ecosystem that we're part of. I'm also recognizing a lot of familiar faces amongst the participants, also coming from the industry side and patient advocacy side, which have been instrumental in driving this dialogue forward. So one thing that I would want to ask you once we go to the next slide is for you to recap of what has been the impact of these guidelines. So we're showing you here an initial feedback from a small samples of surveys that PFMD distributed asking, so, okay, we have a country guidelines, we have these reasonable agreements, the guiding principles. Has it moved the needle? What has changed on the ground? I will not be reading through these bullet points. You can do it while I speak or just do it later. But I would just want to say that it's not just enough for us to talk about it, not just enough to say that there are these guidelines. We actually want to know from you, both from the patient advocacy side and from the industry side, has this been used in practice? Or what are the barriers? And as such, again, we go back to Slido, where I ask you to answer one specific thing. What is the biggest challenge when applying the principles of patient engagement at a country level across different countries? So some of you may be having the roles which are not the country-specific roles. Still think of a barrier. But if you are thinking of a challenge which is tailored to the local regulation, when addressing that barrier, if it is for a particular market, a country, please also mention that country. It is super helpful. You know, let's just spend 2 minutes on this slide gathering these thoughts, and it could also be a very good fertile ground for our panel discussion later on. So I will not be commenting on this, and thank you for your thoughts and theirs, but I do second that what you are saying, that there is really low level of awareness that these guidelines exist. There is also lack of clarity on what we mean by fair market value at the national level. From a practical example, so look, I'm based in Lithuania, and I serve 3 different roles in patient advocacy world: national, European, global. it's still me, still say similar skill set, and of course remuneration is different if I'm attending a national event in Lithuania or if I'm attending a meeting of a global advocacy leaders somewhere, let's say in US or in Switzerland. Still the same people, still the same skill set, just the type of interaction is different. There are things that I may not personally like why my work is being remunerated differently, but this is how the world works. It's stable. The person living in Switzerland is getting a different salary than the person who is living in Lithuania, for example. So there are some limitations that we have to accept, but there are things that we can do and we to do to address it. And I also believe that a lot of discussion needs to happen. So as a departing thought from before I hand over, I see that the good progress was made when these topics were discussed and the compliance people from the industry side, compliance officers, the patient engagement leaders, and the patient advocates were at the room at the same time talking with each other. So we know the patient engagement leaders are always pushing for like let's get more patients' voice in. The compliance officers has a very important role to safeguard the risks, but in between these lines, I can tell you from practice, a lot of things that are solvable are being seen as like this Leviathan beast that cannot be addressed, which is immovable, when actually when people sit and talk, it is possible to find the solutions and they are not that difficult, considering that, you know, this work has been going on for over a decade, but industry has been engaging patient community for decades, 30, 40, 50 years. So there's a wealth of knowledge within the companies you represent and within the ecosystem. And we are openly talking about it and sharing this without breaching any confidentiality here. So I thank you, 18 people or more, I see 3 more are typing for these contributions. Super helpful, will be reviewed after, and let's see if we can delve a bit deeper into the panel part. So that's it from me. I hand to Susan to walk you through some brilliant case studies in different markets.
Oh, thank you so much. And hello, everyone. Susan Daniels, really pleased to be here today. I lead a patient engagement team at Lumanity. We're a health consultancy and communications company, and we regularly partner with the biopharmaceutical industry as well as patient advocacy groups. And we're very pleased to be partnering with PFMD, helping them develop the country cards, which you've just seen. So in this next session, myself and Andrea are going to take you through just 4 examples of the country cards. We've chosen 4 countries which we hope will give you a diverse overview of the types of information, and these are 4 very different and distinct examples. And also we're going to highlight some of the recent changes that some of these country cards and guidance has undergone recently. If I could have the next slide, please. I've seen there are lots of great comments already in the chat, so really want to make sure we have some time to take some questions, but certainly these country cards are available on the Synapse the PFMD website that you can visit at any time. And I'd also like to note that they are constantly updated and going through revisions. So it's actually a good idea to check back frequently for changes. And in the case of the UK and Japan, which I'm going to talk about, we're in the process right now of making those updates so that hopefully they will be updated and live for you very soon. I'd also like to stress that these country cards are an attempt to collect and collate and to some degree form a consistent resource for you, but they should not be used as the official guidance. Where we can, we have signposted you in the cards to the groups like FPA and IFPMA that will give you the guidance, but also recommend that you check with your local country guidance in every case. And if there's ever any question, that you are in contact with those groups directly to make sure you have the most recent interpretations and guidance. Before we get into the country cards, we've also generating these, developed, I think, some top tips and guidance that we'd like to share whenever you are looking at an engagement opportunity between industry and organizations. And would like to also stress that these cards are relevant to both industry partners and patient organizations. You've heard that there are a real diversity of sources within each country that produce guidance, and so the recommendation here is to always look at each of those sources whenever you are considering an engagement and not to rely on a single source. As well, there's a lot of in-country variation, so be very aware of the geography in which you are operating. And in the case here, as we've mentioned, Australia and Canada not only have national guidance, but also regional guidance that would apply. Lexicon and language, as ever, when looking at patient engagement is so important, and this is no different here. Different countries, different groups will use different language, so be mindful of that. Terms like customer engagement versus patient engagement are used. Some countries will use terminology like patient organization rather than patient advocacy group. So it's very important to be mindful of that. And of course, the diversity of the guidance varies, and there's still a lot of gray because it is guidance. And there are countries with very little guidance, but also the opposite is true. In the case of countries like the UK and Canada, the guidance is very, very comprehensive and consistently updated. But this can be challenging as well to really understand whether you are interpreting the vast amount of guidance correctly. So once again, suggestion here is really to do your research, consult the country cards, but please do consult your individual country and regional guidance just to make sure that everything is very much vetted through those lenses. So we'll have a look quickly then at the UK. And as I mentioned, the UK currently through the ABPI has a very, very stringent and very well elucidated set of guidance when it comes to engagement. They have recently, though, made changes. And again, this reinforces the need and point to constantly revisit the site to update those. These are broadly speaking in 4 areas related to remuneration or payment, hospitality, expenses, and TOV or transfer of value reporting. So you can see that in just 3 years, there have been some significant changes to the guidance, and I will very quickly highlight some of the most important changes. Firstly, there is now an update to include the fact that you need to include a contractual clause that obliges patient organizations to publicly declare services. In the case of hospitality, there are very, very strict and well elucidated rules, but now they will apply to virtual engagements and meetings, not just to live or in person, and similar caps and proportionality applies. There is now a requirement to increase the detail around disclosing the description of the services, of course, without breaching confidentiality, but there's a recommendation for this to be much more detailed. And also recommendations for how companies and how patient organizations disclose any transfer of value. And this should be done publicly, very clear guidance on how this is done, and actually more specifically to include things like number of individuals and the types of services that are being contracted. Next slide, please, Aurora. Just for anyone who is engaging in the UK, we would recommend that what you're doing sort of immediately is looking at the templates to make sure they are compliant with these new clauses. Make sure anyone engaging within your organizations, particularly in the case of our industry partners, are aware of these changes so they can be explained when you are entering these engagements and contracts. Make sure that you revise your transfer of value reporting so that you are including not just simply stating the services, but a much more comprehensive description of that service. And of course, look at what the new disclosure, public disclosure means in terms of how organizations are being requested to do that, including a gateway link that is available in the UK for them to do that. So making sure that your teams are very familiar with these new changes. I'll move on then to Japan, which is the next card we've chose to take a look at. And this is a very, very recent change. Just in October, the JPMA Code of Practice, which largely focuses on promotion, have updated their guidelines. So we're in the process of updating the country card. And this is a significant change since the last update in 2019. What it means very practically is now written agreements are mandatory before any support is undertaken, and these records must be retained for transparency. The scope of those engagements has been described or is requested to be described in much more detail, including in-kind transfer of value. They've importantly included calculation for remuneration and how you might itemize that, and what sort of requirement is for reimbursement. They've added some language around social acceptability, which again points to the concept of there being some gray areas, because social acceptability is still open to interpretation. But really what that means is that in describing your engagement, can you legitimately say that is a reasonable and fair engagement based on what the public would deem appropriate? And there's much better and clear guidance around disclosing those engagements to the public. They should be accessible and understood by the public for them to really have a transparent disclosure of that available. So lots of significant change in Japan, and I know more and more companies, industry are engaging with patients in Japan. So I really encourage you to have a look at those changes. And with that, I will hand over to Andrea to look at another two of our country cards.
Thank you very much, Susan. I will indeed continue talking a bit about some specifics regarding the country codes from Netherlands and Italy. Before I go a bit more into detail, I just wanted to mention that indeed also in my day-to-day activity as a compliance advisor, I also have to look at these country cards, country codes, additional laws or regulations quite often, because we have a lot of partners and clients which interact with the industry, either pharmaceutical, medtech, medical associations, which they really want to enable a bit more the engagement with patient groups, patient advocacy, or patients at local or at regional level. And often they to find themselves in the situation where they're not sure if it's allowed, if it's not allowed, what are the restrictions, what are the obligations. Sometimes, of course, some countries are very good at this, and they do mention, let's say, at least a chapter about engaging with patient groups, if not necessarily patients as individuals. But there are also a lot of other countries that they mention very vaguely this term. Sometimes they do refer at patients organizations. Sometimes they just keep it very broad, and it's very difficult to understand from the country code itself what is the actual rule or what is that you are not maybe allowed to do. That's why also our purpose in partnership with PFMD is to develop these country cards that will help a bit the industry have a starting point and understand where they stand and where they should be looking at more in detail whenever they are at the beginning of their journey or during a phase where they want to engage more with the patient groups or patients as individuals. Talking now about the Netherlands, in this specific case, the CGR Code of Conduct for Pharmaceutical Advertising, they do refer to interactions with patients' organizations and other parties who directly or indirectly might influence the prescription supply or use of medicinal products. So they do cover this type of stakeholders in the Code of Conduct. However, they don't have a specific chapter that is designated to maybe engaging with a patient at individual level. So the interpretation can vary. And of course, we can understand that you are encouraged to engage with a patient group. So in the patient as an individual should be part of a patient group. Then you should have a contract with that patient organization. And this is the way of doing compliance engagement with a patient group. Of course, the code also has explanatory note document where they mention the different roles that the patient can play in the interactions between the patient organization and the industry, either pharma or medtech. It's depending on the situation. And then they do mention that it can be either a patient organization that can collaborate with the companies and make an agreement regarding their purpose and scope of work, a patient advocate that can represent, of course, the patient organizations, but they do also mention experienced experts, which are defined as the people who suffer from the illness themselves, and they can explain what their needs are, what they find important for quality of healthcare and life based on their own experience. So we are, let's say, in a situation where the term is explained, the definition is there. However, when it comes to maybe a more clear guidance in terms of fair market value, we go again to the explanatory notes that states an hourly rate for patient advocates or patient organization representatives. They fall into the other category as it's named in the explanatory notes. And for example, for 2025, the maximum hourly rate you can provide is 97 euros. And then what it's interesting to notice here is that even though the patient advocates or organization representatives, they do have an hourly rate, there's no clear guidance on an hourly rate for an experienced patient. So even though the definition is there, of course, you can understand from the guidance that is you have to engage through a patient organization or a patient advocacy group. However, it is mentioned that for experienced experts, which are the people who suffer from the illness, in this case, you can maybe reimburse expenses up to 75 euros in very specific context. So this is indeed one of the examples where the code, I think, is quite comprehensive in terms of their stakeholders. They do mention patient organization, they do mention patient advocates. They do have a definition for experienced experts. However, there is no clear guidance on the hourly rate for an individual patient. So that's why the interpretation can be, of course, that you should engage via a patient advocate group or a patient organization. Now moving into the next slide, I will walk you through the same details about Italy. The code itself, it does regulate the interactions between pharmaceutical companies, patient associations, and expert patients. Here too, we can find a clear definition of the expert patients, which are the individuals that live with the experience of a medical condition who can provide advice, insights, or input to pharmaceutical companies or patient organization in a professional or a structured capacity. Again, the code does not specify a specific rate for engaging with expert patients. However, they do provide a note that you can provide remuneration to expert patients as long as it's reasonable, appropriate, and proportionate to the nature of the assignment. Of course, for this purpose, a written agreement must specify the assignment, of course, and the payment criteria. So that is why I believe Italy is also another example where here we do have express definition of expert patient. It is mentioned that you can remunerate them, but again, maybe there is a lack of clear indication of what would that rate be. So when looking at these country codes, you will see, of course, these nuances either more emphasized or less emphasized. That's why it's very important to look also at the other type of regulations or legislations besides the country code itself or the code of ethics. So when starting to engage with a patient group or patient, of course, there is guidance, but then there are also other resources that you can consult that maybe can help you with starting this process. I think the overall message is that, of course, engaging with patient and patient groups is important. It should be possible. And then the starting point, of course, it's the guidance at local level, then at regional level. And that's why our purpose here also with the PE guidelines is to try to have a starting point for everyone to look at and understand what is the guidance at local level. That was my case study for Italy. I will pass it back to Grit that can continue. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Thank you so much, everybody. And I realize, you know, we were hoping to have many more minutes for the Q&A, but I have seen some fantastic exchanges in the chats. Thank you for everyone for actively listening, participating. And there are some questions in there that it would be really nice to have the speakers perhaps address. A couple times there was a question with regards to if the codes address IMP, so investigational medicinal products, separately to marketed products when engaging with patient advocacy groups or patient organizations. And wondering if there's anyone of the speakers who could address that particular question. Or in fact, if there's anyone from the audience who likes to elaborate, of course.
I can give it a try. Great. Silence always makes me nervous on calls. Good. So I think it's a question that we receive quite often, and the codes itself don't distinguish. I mean, I'm referring to the code doesn't separate between investigational medicinal products and marketed ones when it comes to working with patient organizations, but we apply the same principles. So transparency, respect for independence, absolutely no promotion. And then when it comes to clinical trials, you can raise awareness about a clinical trial, but you can't infer anything about safety, about efficacy, and things like that. So, you know, summary, we don't treat investigational products as a special case. We apply the same principles.
Fantastic, thank you. Hopefully that addresses the question posed. Then another question that came up was with regards to the UK. So perhaps Susan, you can address this. And the question is, does highlighting education content mean that we cannot invite the patient organizations to collective events or meetings?
No, absolutely not. What it does indicate is that there's an actual increased emphasis on making sure that you're disclosing that the primary purpose of your engagement is for educational purposes. And actually, I would encourage you to make sure that that's part of any communication you have, including invitations, so that it's very clear that the balance and the intent of the event is for educational purposes, but certainly would not prevent people engaging. And if I may, Greet, I did notice a few other comments people made quite rightly that, you know, it does feel a bit onerous when you have to, particularly for patient advocacy groups, to be looking at following all of this guidance. And I would say, certainly as others have, that this is, you know, intended really to protect the interests of both industry and patient engagement. But what it does mean is that you need to dedicate the right amount of time to have the right contracts in place to make sure that you have looked at the guidance. So when you are engaging, there has to be very realistic and transparent expectations, I think, between both partners in terms of the time that's going to be involved to get these agreements in place. And that's very important when planning any engagement.
Thank you, Susan, for elaborating. Andrea, there's a question with regards to the Netherlands, and I think it's more of a clarification around the 75 euros, if that was around reimbursement of expenses, or was that in regards to remuneration?
Yes, thank you for the question. Indeed, according to our interpretation, it's related to expenses because they don't mention a specific rate for engaging with patient experts as individuals. Reading through the code, of course, they encourage engagement via the patient organization and patient group. That is why they have established an hourly rate for this other category. And indeed, I think according to some specific situations, the committee agreed that it might be reasonable to reimburse expenses up to that amount in a very specific context to an individual, of course, but it's always recommended to make sure you are engaging through a patient group or patient organizations.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
We have Nobutaka from Japan who mentioned, and I think this was as a comment, that the JPMA Code of Practice is the only one that can really be referred to in that in the context, and the other documents that were referred to are more guidance documents. So I don't know if there's any extra comment, Nobutaka, that you would like to unmute and comment on.
Thank you very much for actually taking up my comments, and basically actually no additional comment from my end, but I just actually mentioned that there's a series, several kind of guidelines mentioned in the country code, but country card, but those of most of them are not really actually talking about code of practice, code of conduct, and that's what I would like to mention. And maybe actually for future, I can actually help kind of elaborating the kind of country card for Japan.
Thank you very much. And I see we are coming to an end, and there's been some great comments and thoughts in the chat as well that I'm sure we'll be sharing. Before we sign off, I'd like to highlight, and maybe Sarunas, you could highlight the first upcoming PEOF Virtual session, which is the PEOF Plus Virtual CEE.
Pleasure, agreed. So this will be soon, in 2 weeks, actually. Central Eastern Europe, that's what CE stands for. I'm very glad to see we have a very good dynamics in the region. That's the region where I'm coming from. So yes, we are in European Union, but still there are big disparities between the Western countries and the countries we have joined the EU post 2000. I'm very glad to see that there is good dynamics. And still, the issue of the funding and sustainability in the advocacy world is critical. Many markets in this region are small. However, I know it from the different interaction with pharmaceutical companies. In many companies, the Central Eastern European region is the fastest growing commercial region in out of all of the regions in the portfolio. So it makes sense to discuss the sustainability of funding pathways for the patient organizations, and you will be there with a very good speakers. And I think it would be insightful also if you are coming from, let's say, South Africa, South America, from Africa, Southeastern Asian countries, because I would think you would relate to many of the issues, and some of the solutions could be applicable as well. So please join there.
Thank you. And then there are 2 other sessions coming up. So later in November, around shaping EMA's vision for patient engagement, patient experience data. And then we have a to be determined date, or to be confirmed date, around the JP and PAC seminar around the principles of market value in PE activity. So hoping you will sign up for these. We see the comments that yes, this session perhaps was too short of time for the richness of the information shared. I want to thank everybody who participated, also in putting their hands up and saying that they would like to be involved in particular countries. So thank you for that. And a big round of applause to our speakers as well for elaborating on the topics today. Thank you so much. And please do not forget to just click a number on this survey. We're not asking much, it's just one. So please go ahead and finish the survey. That would be very valuable to us. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of day wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Should I end the poll?